just the first few minutes of the film. I think it just sets everything up nicely, gives you the frame that I'm describing. And that's about 5 minutes. And then after that, we'll come back, talk a little bit more. We can see if you have any questions. And then I have a couple of other shorter clips to show you. Actually, one shorter and the other is about the same amount of time. And then I think by then, Andrea McClellan, who's a city council member in Norfolk, who's also in the film, as well as retired Navy Admiral Ann Phillips, also in the film, are going to join us to really give us a sense of what's going on in the region now, what should our expectations be, how are they measuring progress. So why don't we go ahead and start that first clip, Lily?
Great. Okay. And as Roger mentioned, we're going to pause after the first clip and the subsequent clip for discussion. If everybody could just stay muted during the clip, that would be great.
Everywhere you look, you see little lakes, ponds, there's water everywhere.
That water is the economic lifeblood of this region. That's why the port is here. That's why the military is here. It serves the world's largest naval base. And flooding is impacting all the bases in Hampton Roads.
It's not possible to wall off all that water. There's just too much.
The Chesapeake Bay, the rivers, all the inlets, they surround and penetrate all the cities.
Before the Navy came in, this was just a bunch of marshland. They built the bases, they built housing for the bases, they built shops for the houses, and that's what created Hampton Roads.
Hampton Roads, it's a center of gravity for the United States as a port, as a national security center.
We have to have sailors that are ready to go to fight our nation's battles. And that training is done here. And the ability for them to go home and see their families is part of what makes them capable of going out and fighting our nation's wars when called upon. If this installation is not ready to support our warfighting platforms, then those warfighting platforms are less capable when they do go out and fight.
When our sailors and their families are negatively affected by the floods, it puts our national security at risk. Flooding is happening more frequently. It's happening on sunny days. I cannot drive on the road that's adjacent to my house 20-30% of the month. We can't, as a city, afford that ourselves. We need support from the region, we need support from the state, we need support from the nation.
There's 80 years from the turn of the century. We have the ground sinking and the waters rising. This entire landscape will be different then. And how different it is and what it looks like is up to us to determine. But if we don't start acting now, it will get ahead of us and it will become much more costly, much more difficult, and we will not have the ability to make as many decisions for our future as we do right now.
course 150, sir. Sunburn is right. 25 Henry, return your previous frequency, please.
With over 80 ships and 30 plus squadrons and 10 plus submarines, it's our largest naval base, naval concentration area, if you would, in the world, is right there in the greater Hampton Roads area. And we're not going anywhere. We, along with the community, have to figure out how we're going to address this challenge.
The Hampton Roads region has been in use by military and merchant mariners since pre-Revolutionary War times. There's always been a presence here because of its proximity to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. The region is 17 cities and municipalities that stretch from the peninsula, Williamsburg, south to the far eastern corner of Tidewater, Virginia.
Okay, so that's the intro to the film. The film itself is about 40 minutes long. It is designed to be short because the folks that we're trying to convene generally are busier than what you might expect, I guess, at a film festival audience. And that's really where I think we try to be most useful with our work. I should say I am the director of a nonprofit called the American Resilience Project. It was formed to help really build upon the work that I'd been doing with film, really make the work mission-driven and allow us to connect with other organizations that are working in a similar space that are trying to, or maybe have not yet explored the use of narrative in their work. I think what a good story can do is it can in fact illuminate universal truths. I know it's hard to believe in this political and communication ecosystem that we have right now that there is such a thing as a universal truth. But I think on a deep emotional level, I mean, there are things that, as I mentioned earlier, there really isn't a political camp that's against saving lives and money. And so when I speak to conservative audiences, I'll often start with that. And that's really the audience I'm trying to reach with this kind of work. I'm not trying to preach to the choir. Sometimes I do have to tell more liberal friends that, no, the military is not all that bad. They're doing some good things. They're not just killing dolphins and making war. I have to sort of get into that conversation every now and again. But mostly, I'm sitting in front of conservative audiences that have never really thought about climate change in terms of other than, oh, that's a liberal issue. And any kind of win that we give on, any ground we give on that's going to be a win for the liberals. And, that's a sort of toxic construct that I'm trying to dissolve, I guess, with this kind of work. I think starting with what is it that unites us? I mean, what are the broad elements of every story that unites the widest number of people? And I think that's what the medium of film is really well designed to do, because it taps into emotions in ways that policy papers just simply cannot. White papers don't necessarily bring tears to your eye, and they might make you interested and want to learn more. But it's not the sort of deep resonance that I think a film or some other creative medium that's built around story and narrative can empower you to get something done. And so, in thinking about the personal connections, I had started off by trying to tell the story of the U.S. military. It's not very personalized, but in understanding that there are real people who, they're not the top brass. They're just the sort of regular sailors and soldiers, Marines on the ground who have to get to work every day. And when I started hearing stories about how some roads are impassable, not just when a storm comes, but when it's high tide, that was the way to take the personal and connect it to this overarching story of national security. So if we look at the next clip, we'll see what I mean. I think this illustrates a little bit more along the lines of what does this mean for people in their real lives, and how can all of us, whether you're Democrat or Republican, or you like having a strong military, you want less money spent on the military, how we can all relate to this and we can all feel some kind of empathy or sympathy, at least, for the folks that are telling their stories in this film. So we can cue up the second clip, and we'll come back and I'll talk a little bit more.
Constant environmental challenges degrade readiness over time, which could impede our ability to operate downrange. I am a surface warfare officer, ship driver. Spent 31 years driving ships. I retired as a rear admiral, and my last command was command of the amphibious forces on the east coast of the United States. There's a certain element to living here, dealing with water, that adds a little element of stress to daily life. Those of us that live here all the time have kind of gotten used to it, but you move here from California and the first night you drive home and realize you need to wait up your street, that's sort of a shock. And that's a little stressor, and those stresses add up over time, especially in a military life. It's stressful enough.
It's unnecessary stress, and it's stress that a lot of people here in this region have to go through. They don't always have the convenience of having family nearby to help them out. So when a service member leaves and they leave their family behind who've never experienced this, it affects the way they work, the way they do their job, the way they can complete their mission.
I think if you look at the Navy family, most of it lives in those communities. So, whether they own a house, whether they rent a house, that sailor is also a Sunday school teacher, that sailor is also a Little League coach.
Okay, so that's another example of the personal in all this, and I should say, I talked about the mission of the American Resilience Project. It's also to enhance civic engagement. I mean, I come at this from a belief that underlying all of our ability to get anything done on this is the question of trust. And if we don't trust our elected officials, and we don't trust our institutions, and we don't trust the media or our neighbors or the other folks in our community, all these great policy analyses will not really ever get to have the intended effect. And so I think, starting with trusted messengers is really the key. And I hope that this information can be useful to all of you as you go out there. My goal is not to turn you all into filmmakers. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about filmmaking if you are interested in using this tool to help advance the collective work that we're doing. But I think anybody can become a better communicator. And it doesn't mean that you have to take a public speaking class. It's simply that you have to understand who are the trusted messengers. And maybe it's not you. I don't necessarily put myself out there as a trusted messenger, simply because I don't have the military background. I'm not a conservative with street cred in the conservative community. I try to be as nonpartisan and apolitical as I can be when I'm speaking to diverse audiences. But I think, when we look at the example of Vice President Gore, whatever you think of Al Gore, as hard as he worked to make his film, I think that there are a lot of people who, just because of who he is and because of what he's identified with, i.e. the Democratic Party, that he was dismissed. And I think that's a reality that we all have to acknowledge, and for practical purposes, we need to accept. There are too many leaders, I think, that put themselves out there as sort of the face of something when they should step out of the limelight and advance somebody else who happens to be more trusted. I think politicians make this mistake all the time. We see, I think, as evidenced by the fact that so many, just decide they're going to run for president, that they're the only one that can solve our problems. I think, a little humility goes a long way. And I think that humility will allow us to think, who are the most trusted members of our community? Or if I'm going to speak to the Chamber of Commerce, or we're going to go talk to the realtors in the insurance industry to talk to them about managed retreat and, why we need to change some policies around coastal building, for example. I mean, there's so many issues that touch this issue. It's not just about you or me. It's about who is understand that audience, and who are they going to listen to? So I think that's really the first question that we all have to ask ourselves as we try to do this organizing work and we try to educate folks in our communities. So with that said, the last clip that I'm going to play is it also presents a personal story, but one that flows from a Hampton Roads Planning District Commission meeting. I actually got my latest film on modernizing the electric grid was just reviewed in an academic journal that one for librarians that purchase academic films. And it was a good enough review, but one of the criticisms that they gave was that it felt a little dry and insular at times. And I think that's right. I cannot film a city council meeting or a public service commission meeting or a planning district commission meeting without running the risk of it feeling somewhat dry and insular. I joked with the distributor that next time we'll leave the car chase scene in the film. But it's just one of those things where, you can't just turn on the camera and let the whole meeting go for 2 hours and then expect people to kind of get excited about it. I mean, that's where some real editing is required. And the clip that you're about to see from the Planning District Commission meeting, the intention in putting it in there was first and foremost to make those officials accountable by having a record. I didn't know what was going to unfold when I filmed it, but it turns out that the executive director of that Planning District Commission, who took it well, he took it in stride, he didn't complain to me, but I know that, just looking at the footage and hearing what other folks had to say, he didn't come across looking that good. It's not to say that he's not doing a good job. I'm not passing judgment on that. But in the clip, it looked like he needed to step up his game a little bit. And I've been told, it's hard to measure this stuff other than just your anecdotal evidence, that he did step up his game. And if Andrea, or one of our guests who you'll see in the film, who's joined us here on the call, Norfolk City Council member Andrea McClellan, works with this person as part of the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. She's the one that posed a very hard question that he didn't answer well, which is precisely why he didn't look very good. He didn't have a good answer. I think, just by showing up with a camera, even if you're not aspiring to be a filmmaker, it's just a really good exercise in holding officials to be accountable if there's no camera already in the room. And in this case, there wasn't. So we were the only camera crew. So it's just another tool in the toolkit. When we're talking about building trust and establishing accountability, I often have for me, to have filmed so much with the military over the years, I have had to gain the trust of high-level officials. And I take it very seriously that I realize that the moment I break that trust, I'll never get an interview with anyone in the military ever again. And this sort of brand that I've been building that kind of straddles the different political fault lines will crumble. So I'm not trying to make anybody look bad. I'm just trying to sort of reveal what's out there. And so you'll see that in this next clip. It's going to be some of the Planning District Commission meeting, talking about what are we doing about sea level rise, and then that will transition into yet another personal story from someone who attended the meeting and told the officials there about her experiences. So let's cue that one up. And then when we come back, Council Member McClellan will join us, and I would love it if she could give us an update on what's going on in Hampton Roads, if the sort of forbidden terms of managed retreat are being spoken, because it is such a politically fraught phrase. Nobody wants to say something that's going to make the real estate tank. It's a thorny issue that we're all dealing with, and we can pick it up on the other side of this clip.
We're working to do as much as we can, and we just need to continue working with our state and federal legislators. Getting support at those higher levels requires good regional cooperation. And until we have that, we're not able to make the changes that are necessary.
We are headed to the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission meeting to see what's on their agenda for the rest of the year. My interest in attending stems from some of this work that I've done locally on sea level rise, resiliency planning and adaptation planning. And of course, the Planning District Commission plays a huge role in how that will take place regionally. This is Llewellyn Avenue. You can see from the flooding marker over here, it's a routine flooder. This is strictly high tide flooding. Tide's high in about 45 minutes here. And so in 45 minutes, I won't be able to get through there. That's life here.
Remain a very high regional priority. So, Madam Chair, I'll conclude my comments by certainly responding to any questions in terms of a recommended action.
Yes, given the fact that what we just experienced recently with regards to flooding, I'm surprised that's not in this agenda. Would it be somewhere else?
So we could add something if that's the direction the commission would like to go. What we would need to determine would be what the specific ask would be.
Yes. May I recommend that we take a look at possibly asking for funding for the revolving fund to help homeowners with mitigation of flood damages. It is a revolving fund that has no money in it. So it is a shell with nothing in it. It is another unfunded mandate, and it seems to me that would be something that would be a very distinct and actionable item.
Thank you.
All right, we'll just take that recommendation into consideration. Our next speaker is Ms. Karen Spates. Good morning.
Good morning, committee members and all those in attendance. Thank you for allowing me a time to speak. I am here as a resident of the city of Norfolk. I live in Chesterfield Heights. My concern is flooding. I'm a caregiver, so one of my problems is getting home to take care of my mother. We can get trapped in, and where I live, when it floods, I can't leave my house. Now during a really bad event, we were in our house for 3 days and couldn't leave.
Periods of rain off and on today. Saying we could get up to a half an inch of rain before it's all said and done by the end of the day. The high today, 51.
Evacuation orders are in place for some, while others are hunkering down for whatever this storm delivers.
If we're having this problem throughout, just not Norfolk, but the other surrounding cities and places of flooding that never flooded before, how will they respond to all of this, and where will we go? I went and bought a life vest for my mom because I was frightened for her safety. And once that water comes in, how do you get out? I know I can get out, but how do I get her out? Hey, Mom. I got something for you. This is just in case, in emergency, if we need to get out or you get sick or something. So I bought you a life jacket.
Me and a life jacket.
Yeah, I bought you a life jacket. So so you can put it on, and you just put your arms in it like that. And just in case we have to go out there in that water and get to safety, just so we'll be okay.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
You're so nice.
I know.
Let's do stuff like this all the time. Very nice.
Thank you.
I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. You having a good day?
Yeah.
All right.
Kind of slow, but good.
And so I don't know if you all saw it, but the audio was a little bit off from the video there. I guess that's just one of those things about large Zoom meetings. But if anybody wants to get access to this film, just let me know. I'd love for you to bring it out into your communities. I mean, for me, it's really all about reaching the qualitative audience. And even if that's a small group of people, we've done a lot of successful brown bag lunches where we show up in a windowless conference room and we play clips from the film, not even the whole film sometimes. And it really has the same effect, I would say, maybe even a more powerful effect than sort of the traditional avenues of distribution for films. You know, I don't mean to eschew the film festivals. I think they're vital, but I think there are a lot of filmmakers that think of that as really the way to measure the success and the outreach of their film, and I don't. I think you know, showing your film on a Tuesday morning to a regional chamber of commerce can be far more effective than getting on a red carpet in some film festival somewhere. So, you know, think about connecting with the right audiences. And again, even if they don't have time and you don't have time to show the 40-minute film, doesn't matter. You can find the clip that works for you. You know, I sort of think about this story as an overarching narrative, but within it, there's all of these sort of modules that you can break out. So think of me as a resource. I'd love to help any of you and talk with you further if there's anything that I can help with as far as communicating, messaging, and convening. So I'd love to open it up for questions and comments and introduce Norfolk City Council member Andrea McClellan, who you saw in the film. She's the one that threw that, which shouldn't have been a curveball, but I guess it landed over the plate like a curveball for Executive Director Bob Crum. Andrea, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Is there anything you want to say? Just give us sort of a quick update of how things look in Hampton Roads these days, any sort of success stories and progress you'd like to give us an update on? You'll have to unmute yourself, Andrea. You gotta click unmute there. We can't hear you.
There we go.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Now we
guys. Technically challenged on Zoom. So since that film, that was probably my second or third meeting at the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. And if you recall from looking around the room, there were several folks who have a few more years of experience than I, and most of whom weren't really paying attention, sadly. And I asked a pretty pointed but obvious and simple question. Since that time, I will tell you this. Bob Crum, the executive director, has kicked it into high gear. No good deed goes unpunished. I am now the vice chair of the Planning District Commission. We now have a committee of elected officials specifically focused on coastal resilience, which I chair. Our legislative agenda now is about 30% of it. It deals with coastal resilience and flooding. So we've changed considerably. Similarly, in Virginia, we have this weird thing where we actually couldn't even say the term sea level rise at the General Assembly, as pathetic as that sounds. We use the term recurrent flooding. That has now changed. We can say sea level rise. We don't really talk about climate change still. We're still inching our way there. And we are focused on a variety of legislation and bills. We just experienced Hurricane Dorian, which was a tropical storm here. The flooding was significant and similar to what you showed in the film, or worse. Basically, the entire city shut down. We were really fortunate, though. We didn't have any significant winds, power outages, trees down, personal damage. And so because the city, we've gotten used to this. We know to move cars to our public garages. The citizens know what to do. And now we recovered very nicely. So we were very lucky, and hopefully that will continue in the future. What else that I could tell you about?
Can I ask a quick question? Let me jump in. Does anyone, you mentioned not being able to talk about climate change. Does anyone say the words managed retreat?
No. But I will say that the city of Norfolk, we are talking about climate change. As a matter of fact, so the city to date has really effectively been dealing with climate change adaptation. We've said it floods. How do we address it? How do we become the coastal community of the future? What we haven't done to date, up until last year, was to talk about climate change mitigation. And now we are doing that as well. So I'm really proud of that. So we're looking at our carbon footprint. How do we become more energy efficient as a city? And how do we reduce our carbon footprint, recognizing the causality of the flooding that's here. But that's new and that's different, and we are unique in our region to be doing that. So I often talk about the differences between adaptation and mitigation and climate change. People tend to lump everything together, and I think it's important to talk about that. But in terms of managed retreat, no, we don't talk about that here. Politically, it's not very tenable. And I would think, I would say maybe in a smaller community, it becomes a more reasonable discussion. But in a city of Norfolk of 250,000, with the largest naval base in the world, with the level 1 trauma center of the region, with the second busiest port on the East Coast, major universities, retreat really is not an option for us in significant manners. We have adopted a new zoning code, which is considered the most resilient in the country, which requires things like 3 foot of freeboard, which requires a resilience quotient to be met that starts to address holding water, stormwater on a property after a rain event. So we are doing very specific things to encourage more appropriate building or not building, if you will. We are looking at taking our FEMA dollars in the future, and rather than encouraging people to raise houses, for the city to purchase the house and demolish them. So in that regard, there is some element of retreat, but it's at a very small level. I just don't think in a city like Norfolk, retreat is an option. When you have a Navy base and a port, they have to be near the water. So we've got to figure out how to deal with it. In a smaller community, a smaller county, maybe that makes more sense. Oops.
Sorry, I think we have Ann Phillips with us. Ann, are you there? Are you the BTV?
I don't know. I don't know what my title is, but I am here. I just don't have a camera that works, so that's
Zoom
fine.
has assigned you some kind of strange identifier code there, but welcome. It's definitely my pleasure also to introduce Ann Phillips, who is a retired admiral who you saw in the film as well, and is now working as a special assistant for coastal adaptation and protection for Governor Northam in Virginia. She's based in Norfolk as well. Andy, you want to add anything to what you just heard Andrea say about the latest? I mean, I think maybe you have more of a statewide perspective now that you're working at the gubernatorial level. What can you tell us about managed retreat? I mean, this is the managed retreat working group for the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. We're just getting our feet wet, no pun intended. And at least for me in the communication space, trying to figure out a way to talk about this so that it doesn't frighten people and turn them off. And I think it is such a difficult topic to bring up. I mean, it conjures up so much negativity and fear that it is challenging to discuss. Is there any conversation about this at the state level? Do you think there should be? And if so, how do we make that happen?
Okay, thank you, Roger. So the biggest challenge with managed retreat is retreat. People don't like that word. They don't want to think about it. They don't really know what it means, but they don't think they like the sound of it. So that's a challenge. At the state level, and believe it or not, there are localities that are planning for this actively in the state of Virginia. And so that shouldn't come as a surprise, but to varying degrees, there are localities that are thinking about this. They are by and large rural areas where they have space to deal with, and a culture that wants access to the water, but doesn't necessarily need to be right on top of it, and is used to living with it already. So, but in the context of a city like Norfolk, who is an independent city, who is has their own territory, but as you said earlier, cities in Virginia, incorporated towns and cities, independent cities, are not in counties. So Norfolk's tax base is Norfolk's tax base. And if Norfolk's tax base starts to leave, then they don't have the income from that tax base, which they need to maintain their infrastructure. Further, they are also, as Councilwoman McClellan said, responsible for the infrastructure of the surrounding military facilities, many of which draw most, if large portions of their utilities and other requirements, and of course their employees, their civilian employees, their contractors, the logistics and supply chains they rely on, all come from the surrounding communities. So there's going to be areas here where we are going to have to come up with other solutions. There are certainly opportunities within larger communities to look at areas that are repeat flooders and try not to repeat those challenges or allow those challenges or those circumstances to continue. So I guess one thing I would challenge your group with is, what do you call this that isn't retreat? And also that isn't a word that sounds like we're going to force people to do it. So my job at the state level, I think, is to figure out a suite of solutions that then can be options and opportunities for localities to use to facilitate access to, such as FEMA grants and other things, which now take 3-4 years to actually complete if you want to elevate a home or you want to buy out, or you want to do some other choices. FEMA actually will also pay to move houses, and there are a lot of challenges with that too. How do we streamline that process? That could be an option in some circumstances. So I feel like my responsibility is to come up with a suite of options and opportunities to facilitate choices for property owners and for localities so that they can have a role in determining what fits best for their future. And it will be different based on where people are, where their community is, what level of water tolerance they have, and what kinds of infrastructure support can be provided over time. So, and then people are going to have to make their own choices, because I think the one thing I figured out over almost a year working in this area now here, specifically for the state of Virginia, is it's not about the water, it's about the people. And once you get public opinion moving in a certain direction, it's very hard to change that direction. And people should have the opportunity to make some choices about their future, but they have to be educated as to what the circumstances are within which they are making those choices. And that's a part of my responsibility and the state's responsibility, I think.
Great. Thanks, Anne. And I think what you said there, it's not about the water, it's about the people. That's a sort of an idea that I apply to everything that I work on, which is, it's not about the climate, it's about the people. It's not about the carbon, it's about the people. So this is all about quality of life. I think that's the frame that any kind of conversation related to climate and environment has to take in order to unify people and move the needle. So we have a couple of minutes left. Any questions, comments?
This is Shamika with the Nature Conservancy. I just wanted to thank you for the presentation. I have seen the documentary before, but it's always good to revisit it. I wanted to know, I did see that you had left your email in the chat, but I wanted to know if, I think Anne would potentially leave hers, and maybe even Andrea. The kind of questions I have are more than the 5 minutes that we may have, as well as the desire to just connect beyond this space, to kind of go back and forth to share information. So if you guys could share your email if you're willing, that would be great. And if you're not, let me know and I will get you mine. Thank you again.
Anybody else?
Hi, Jeff Peterson. Just a general question. Is it your thought, Aaron, that in the event that there is some future interest in a national effort to deal with storms and sea level rise, that the Department of Defense interests in Norfolk and other key places would be a reason that it might be that the Department of Defense might be able to speak to a wider political spectrum than perhaps is currently interested? Would Department of Defense interests and issues be a possible way to get Republican as well as Democratic support for a major national investment in dealing with this problem?
And on a macro level, that's been my hope in all of the work that I've been doing over these past few years. Always trying to tie back to national security. For me, it comes down to the fact that as long as the military is considered a trusted messenger, then they're eligible to be the messenger. I mean, if we start seeing their approval ratings get near the level of members of Congress, then I'd have to rethink that idea. But Anne Anne served in the military for many years. She was an admiral and retired a couple of years ago. Anne, you probably have some thoughts on that. You want to give us your perspective on that?
Well, I think, first of all, the military is always going to couch this in terms of readiness and resilience. And the term of art they're using right now that they're willing to say is environmental resilience. And so somebody just asked me about, are we forgetting the natural environment? No, we're not forgetting the natural environment. And that's one place that we can actually reach the Defense Department right now, especially the Navy. They, as an example, in the Hampton Roads region, the Commander Navy Region Mid-Atlantic is responsible for oversight of and implementation and compliance with the Chesapeake Bay Act and Chesapeake Bay environmental regulations under the EPA. And so in that context, there's quite a bit of work that goes on ensuring that compliance. And that gives you an opportunity to look at all kinds of co-beneficial efforts in the context of not only ensuring that you are compliant with these environmental responsibilities, but also that you have an opportunity to manage water and that you can tie that into an awful lot of other opportunities for construction, or infrastructure upgrades in base facilities. Now, having said that, I'm looking for those opportunities. Most of that money, particularly when it comes to new construction on military facilities or improving existing construction, is MILCON dollars, military construction dollars. It's an account that's typically woefully underfunded across all the services. It is now. Just, in keeping with what's been widely reported in the current news, money has been taken from military construction accounts across the services to fund a border wall. So projects that Army, Navy, Air Force thought they were going to be able to do, 77 million worth of projects in Virginia alone, are not going to happen because that money has been moved elsewhere. So the military is challenged in that regard, even to implement programs that were funded and appropriated and that they expected to move forward with. So I think we've seen, and you can look at the Center for Climate and Security's website, a number of a wide swath of senior military officials, both civilian and active duty, in the past 2 years during testimony and other hearings, perhaps championed by Secretary Mattis, but discussing how climate was an impactor on national security and how the changing climate was going to, A, should be acknowledged and recognized, B, that it was human caused, and C, that it was going to impact their ability to implement or execute their mission. So if you look at the Center for Climate and Security's website, you can find a listing of those individuals and what their specific quotes were that may be of some value. But the military is certainly going to be very sensitive to the challenges with dealing with an administration that is openly hostile to climate change or even discussing the issue. And they will be very careful there because they want to stay in the readiness lane and they want to focus on resilience. And that's
can I just add as well? Hey, Roger.
Yes.
Just to add, in terms of the military, and we've got a good relationship with the Navy, of course, in Norfolk, but we have really the military doesn't spend any money outside of the gates, right? So we've got 40 to 50,000 sailors and civilians going on the largest naval base in the world every day, traversing our roads that are flooded. And we're not getting any funding from the federal government to deal with that. There was legislation that was adopted a year ago called the Defense Access Roads Act that's supposed to start addressing that, but it has no money in it, virtually no money, not at national level. So the fact that the military is here would suggest that Norfolk could ultimately survive maybe longer than other coastal cities because there is such an investment in the area. But at this point, we're not seeing any investment outside of the Navy base into the community.
All right. Well, we're at the top of the hour. Go ahead, Patrick. I think you're going to wrap us up.
Oh, no. Thank